Welcome to the English Vault. Today, we follow Keanu Reeves into a story about how a life touched by pain produced a public image of calm, patience, and kindness. This is not a dense documentary. It is a clear story for listening, built around pressure, choice, patience, and change. The tone is warm, cinematic, human, but the path stays human. One person facing a world that does not open easily. The focus is personal losses, humility, patience, cinema, and reinvention. Under those facts, there is a more useful question. What does a person do when talent is not enough, when pressure grows, and when the next step is still unclear? To understand Keanu Reeves, we have to begin before the applause, before the headlines, and before the world decided what the name should mean. Chapter 1: A Life in Motion. At the beginning, Keanu Reeves was not a symbol. Keanu Reeves grew up moving between places, cultures, and family changes before the world knew his face. This first stage matters because every later achievement was built on a person who still had to learn how to stand inside uncertainty. People often look at a finished life and imagine a straight road, but a real beginning is rarely straight. It is made of small rooms, awkward moments, private doubts, and the slow discovery of what kind of effort will be required. For Keanu Reeves, the early pressure created a quiet kind of training. It taught observation, patience, and the ability to keep moving even when the future looked much smaller than the dream. The important thing is that the story did not begin with certainty. It began with movement, and movement was enough to open the first door. Chapter 2: Finding the Camera. In Chapter 2, Finding the Camera, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. Acting offered a space where quiet intensity could become visible without needing loud explanation. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of finding the camera is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 2 matters. Finding the camera shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 2 closes, finding the camera has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 3: Fame Without the Usual Shape. In Chapter 3, Fame Without the Usual Shape, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. As his career grew, his public image did not become a simple story of glamour or ego. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of fame without the usual shape is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 3 matters. Fame without the usual shape shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 3 closes, fame without the usual shape has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 4: Loss and Silence. In Chapter 4, Loss and Silence, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. Publicly known personal losses added a deeper tone, to how many people understood his calm presence. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of loss and silence is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 4 matters. Loss and silence shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 4 closes, loss and silence has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 5: The Matrix Moment. In Chapter 5, The Matrix Moment, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. The Matrix turned him into an icon of action, philosophy, technology, and strange modern destiny. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of the Matrix moment is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 5 matters. The Matrix moment shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 5 closes, the Matrix moment has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 6: Disappearing and Returning. In Chapter 6, Disappearing and Returning, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. Careers in film rise and fall, and his path included quieter, years before new roles brought him back. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of disappearing and returning is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 6 matters. Disappearing and returning shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 6 closes, disappearing and returning has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 7: John Wick and Reinvention. In Chapter 7, John Wick and Reinvention, the story moves into a sharper kind of pressure. John Wick transformed grief, discipline, and controlled movement into a second major cultural moment. This stage is specific because it changes the problem in front of Keanu Reeves. Progress now requires a different kind of attention. The challenge of John Wick and Reinvention is not solved by one perfect decision. For Keanu Reeves, it becomes a chain of practical choices, emotional adjustments, and private standards that slowly reshape the direction of the journey. That is why Chapter 7 matters. John Wick and Reinvention shows that growth is not a clean staircase. It is a test of whether pressure will make the person smaller, louder, wiser, or more focused. By the time Chapter 7 closes, John Wick and Reinvention has changed the meaning of the story. What began as one challenge now points toward a larger question about discipline, courage, identity, and direction. Chapter 8: Kindness as Legacy. By the final part of the story, the question is no longer only what Keanu Reeves achieved. The story that remains is not only about movies, but about how gentleness can survive public pressure. The larger question is what the journey can show us about pressure, identity, and the cost of becoming visible. A public life can look clean from far away. It can look like a list of wins, titles, products, songs, races, speeches, or moments. Up close, it is usually messier. There are doubts, wrong turns, criticism, and days when the next step feels heavy. That is why this story matters, for listening practice and for life. It gives us a human rhythm, a beginning, a test, a break, a return, and a meaning that becomes clearer only after time passes. One reason this story works is that Keanu Reeves does not become interesting only after success arrives. The interesting part is the formation, the habits, the pressure, the private standards, and the moments when no applause is available. Those hidden years make the later public image easier to understand. Another part of the story is the relationship between identity and work. A person can be talented and still lose direction. A person can be praised and still feel pressure. What matters in Keanu Reeves' journey is the ability to return to the work with clearer eyes. There is also a lesson about timing inside Keanu Reeves' path. Many lives change because preparation and opportunity finally meet. When that happens, the world may call it luck, but the person inside the story knows how much practice came before the door opened. For the English Vault, the value of this story is its rhythm. The sentences are clear, but the emotion is real. You can follow the events while also hearing useful words about ambition, pressure, patience, courage, and change, connected to personal losses, humility, patience, cinema, and reinvention. And perhaps the deepest point is this: becoming known does not remove difficulty, it often increases it. The challenge for Keanu Reeves is to keep a human center when the world begins to turn a real person into a symbol. The story also reminds us that public results are usually late evidence of private discipline. Long before the world names a person successful, there are small decisions repeated without certainty, and those decisions slowly become the shape of a life. What makes Keanu Reeves' journey useful is not perfection. It is the visible struggle between fear and action, between the old identity and the next one, between what the world expects and what the person keeps trying to build. Every chapter in this story carries a different kind of vocabulary: pressure, patience, risk, identity, discipline, and return. The words matter because they help us hear the emotional structure of a life, not only the public facts. When people remember Keanu Reeves, they often remember the finished image first. But a better story asks what had to be endured before that image existed, and what had to be protected when attention became intense. That is why the ending should not feel like a simple celebration. It should feel like a landing, a moment to see the cost, the courage, the limits, and the choices that made the story worth telling. Another useful layer is the difference between a public result and a private system. Keanu Reeves' story becomes stronger when we look at the repeated habits behind the visible moments: the preparation, the revisions, the quiet discipline, and the ability to continue after disappointment. This is also a story about feedback. The world gives feedback through silence, criticism, delay, rejection, or pressure. In Keanu Reeves' journey, the important question is not whether feedback hurts. It is whether feedback becomes information, and whether information becomes a better next decision. The focus on personal losses, humility, patience, cinema, and reinvention helps the episode stay concrete. Instead of treating inspiration as a vague feeling, the story connects it to choices that can be seen: studying, practicing, leading, adapting, rebuilding, and protecting a sense of direction when the outside world becomes loud. There is a second kind of courage here too. It is not the dramatic courage of one heroic moment. It is the slower courage of returning to the work when the work no longer feels new, when progress becomes harder to measure, and when the dream asks for patience instead of excitement. For listeners, this rhythm makes the story useful because the emotional map is clear. There is a beginning, a test, a stretch of uncertainty, a change in identity, and a final question about what remains when success becomes complicated. That complication matters. Becoming visible can solve some problems, but it can also create new ones. More attention can mean more pressure, more responsibility, and more chances to be misunderstood. A strong story does not hide that cost. It lets the cost make the achievement more human. In that way, Keanu Reeves's path becomes more than a biography. It becomes a study of how people keep shaping themselves under pressure. The facts give the story structure, but the deeper movement is emotional: fear, effort, adaptation, and return. So the lesson is not simply to admire Keanu Reeves. The lesson is to notice the mechanism. A person meets resistance, studies the resistance, changes the method, and keeps moving. That pattern is useful in work, learning, creativity, sport, leadership, and ordinary life. If the story has power, it is because it does not ask us to believe in easy transformation. It asks us to respect slow transformation. It asks us to notice that many lives are changed by small decisions repeated long before the world sees the result. By the time the episode reaches its final landing, Keanu Reeves's journey should feel less like a distant legend and more like a human process. The details are specific, but the pattern is familiar. Pressure arrives, identity is tested, and the next choice becomes the real story. That is the final bridge between the story and the listener. We are not only watching Keanu Reeves from a distance. We are practicing how to follow cause and effect, how to hear emotional contrast, and how to recognize the moment when a choice begins to change everything that comes after it. In the end, Keanu Reeves reminds us that legacy is not only what the world remembers. It is also what a person keeps choosing when the easy version of the story is no longer enough. This was another story from the English Vault. Keep listening, keep building your vocabulary, and keep noticing the choices that shape a life. I will see you in the next one.